In Victoria 3, the only two things that are certain are construction and taxes. So if you want to bend your pops over and take them for all they're worth, then you're going to need to strap in, because we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series here today by doing a deep dive on taxes. Now, this video is very likely to be a long one, so feel free to navigate it using the chapters below. To sort of get started, I think there's a useful metaphor to unpack here when it comes to the government's role in terms of influencing the economy, and that's to think of the GDP as a pie. And the government will take a share of that pie, and they will use that share, and they will expend that share of the pie on, military spending, universities, government administrations, and construction, and all of these sectors. And a way to think about it is the larger a share of the pie the government takes, this will depress the economy, and there will be less available to the people, and this will decrease consumption of the people. So as the government takes a larger and larger share, this will depress the economy. In reverse, the more money the government injects into the economy, that's if you're running a deficit, this will boost the economy. So what we're going to do here is you can see we're on 1.6 billion in our GDP, and this is going to be in a scenario where we're kind of extracting a lot of money. Our taxation level is high, we have a lot of consumption taxes, and we don't necessarily have a lot of government spending because our military is not currently raised. What we're going to do here is, in order to illustrate this, is we are going to raise all of that, the army, and also get rid of all the consumption taxes, which will spike our GDP. It's July 19th, 1887, and we're going to come back when we have that fixed up. So we have gotten rid of all of the taxes, and what this will do is it will increase the consumption of all of our consumer goods in the market, which will drive the prices up and make all the buildings more profitable. We have also raised all of the military, and there will be some lagging effect before they're, fully raised, this will increase the prices of all of our military goods in the market. And you can see it's still July 18th, 1887. We have not unpaused yet, but if we take a look, the GDP is already up 0.01 billion or 10 million. And it's important to emphasize this is without the construction of any new buildings, and this is without some of the lagging effects of us getting, injecting more money into the economy like this. And these lagging effects there will be a lot of buildings that were not profitable before, and so they couldn't employ up. And as they employ up, because they're now profitable, because their outputs are more expensive, like clothing and military goods, what this will do is it will increase the employment, it will increase the GDP, and we will be able to tax the pops that are newly employed as well. And so we will be increasing the total pie that we are taxing, but we are taking a smaller fraction of the pie because we have decreased the tax rate. Now, another thing that's also kind of important to take a look at whenever we do something like this, this huge injection of money, is we can look at, and we're going to pause and go for about a month, but we can look at the amount of excess and the amount of taxes that are currently being paid here. If we take an unpause here and we let the game think, next Monday it'll update and the taxes will shoot down and there will be a huge excess. So this will also drive up standard of living, which is relatively important for a variety of things. We just need to wait here for the Monday, and the slow Monday. All the goods in our market currently are going to be increasing in prices. Here's the Monday. Ba-boom, we have a huge excess. This went from like 6 to 16. This one really popped off because we were emphasizing in all of our consumption taxes, we were emphasizing taxing the rich. So there's really a huge excess here. And so the standard of living will climb up. Now, coming into where we're looking at, some of these buildings are going to become more profitable. Now, this is actually a poor example because we didn't increase construction, but this building has become more profitable. It's still not profitable, but there are other ones that have breached the threshold. They're going to start employing more pops as the time goes on, and this is going to be, we're just going to let that event tick through. This is going to stimulate the economy. We're approaching the 19th now, and so let's just take a pause after this Monday because this is going to be, it's not going to recalc. And the GDP has come up 80 million, 1.69 billion, 1.61 billion to 1.69 billion, very nice. And so what's happening here is not really the result of buildings being finished, although there were a few rounds of buildings being finished and increased employment, but this is really being driven by us injecting money into the economy. Now, this is not a sustainable injection because we raised all of the conscripts, but this injection is increasing the size of the pie, which then we are taxing, and also it's increasing, you know, the profitability of a lot of these buildings. Obviously, this one's not profitable, but oh, it is profitable now, and it's employing up now. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about here. This one wasn't profitable before, now it's profitable, and so now the weekly balance is higher. What this weekly balance being higher will do is it will also increase, you know, the investment pool transfer. And so thinking of it in terms of a pie, sometimes you make more money by extracting less money in terms of taxes, although this generally happens very late, when you can tax the dividends specifically, you know, because this is kind of coming on up, and this is going to help fuel the economy in some ways. And it's important to recognize that it is not, you do not just want to extract, because this is going to deflate the size of your GDP. An important note to add here when you're thinking of injecting and extracting from the economy is you really want to think of it in terms of trying to inject in an intelligent way and extract in an intelligent way. So this means we are going to want to tax in the way that is most efficient, and that we are also going to want to spend in the way that is most efficient. So running a whole bunch of extra army raised is not an efficient form of injecting money into the economy, but the most efficient way of injecting money in the economy is construction. So generally speaking, you want to extract a lot of money and then re-inject it through construction as a means of driving up, you know, and stimulating the economy. And this is the best way to stimulate the economy because it adds extra buildings to the economy, whereas, you know, paying for military goods does not add buildings to the economy. Decreasing taxes does not add buildings to the economy, but if the economy already has a lot of consumption, you know, a lot of consumption buildings, it will increase the profitability of those buildings. And so having more of those buildings is a huge driving factor. Now, there are 3 ways in which you can engage in taxation. 4 if you include tariffs. We're going to briefly discuss tariffs here, although it's really more appropriate in kind of a trade thing. Tariffs are not a good means of extracting money from the economy, and the reason being, if we come into the tariff kind of section, is they do not generate a lot of money, but what they also do is they affect your economy in a particular bad way when it comes to trying to affect what proportion of buildings you have that are capitalist or not. And it's a bit much to unpack, but what will happen is if I have a good that I am importing and it has this price, and the price in my market is here, what they will do is they will reach an equilibrium. If I have a good, and then I have a good that I'm importing, and I add a tariff, that effectively increases the price, and so the equilibrium at which they will meet will be higher, and so the market price in my market, I will import less of it, and the market price of the good I am importing will be higher. Generally speaking, the goal of trade is to try and affect prices of goods in a way that you like. So for example, we would want to import tea, and if we are importing tea, this will decrease the price of the tea, which is good because we do not want our auto queue to be producing the tea because we prefer capitalist-owned buildings. And so this is not a good axis from extracting money. Also, what it will do is it will tend to make our buildings less profitable because if we are importing something that is not just being consumed, like let's say fabric, let's find fabric in here. If we are importing fabric, let's say, the equilibrium price will be lower, or sorry, the equilibrium price will be higher if we're importing it, if we are tariffing it, which in turn will make our buildings, like our textile mills, less profitable, and these are capitalist owned, and we really want the profits, and it's not worth the decreased price. We would rather have an increased weekly balance, and then be able to dividends tax them, and also get the investment pool transfer from this building, than we would skimming off with a tariff. The tariffs really don't generate a lot of money, and they negatively affect prices in your market as you're trying to kind of engage in them. Okay, so that's tariffs. All right, so coming back in, we have taxation level, consumption taxes, and wages, which are technically not taxes, but you can think of them in much the same way as taxes. We're going to cover wages first, and we're only going to cover it here and not go into greater depth. On the other two, we're going to go into greater depth later. So for government wages, this will include your construction centers in addition to your government administrations. It will generally represent a much higher percentage of your economy than military wages, unless you decide to have a really huge military, which is probably not worth it relative to construction, but that's kind of a different thing to talk about. In particular, you will get bonuses, and what each of these sliders will do is they will increase the wages by 15%. Now, looking at the government wages, bonuses, and malices, we will see that the malices, you get minus prestige, and also minus approval on the petite bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia. If we increase the the wages, you can get increased authority and also just increased approval on the intelligentsia and the petite bourgeoisie. I probably underutilize this as a means of interaction, to be honest. I think that it is possible that you do want to run kind of lower government wages, as long as your approval rating can kind of bear this sort of thing. And if you want to, play a little more sweaty or a little more precise, closely monitoring approval rate of these parties and, kind of nudging stuff in the direction in order to kind of generate what you want is probably a good idea. Although it is just a little bit, because if you dramatically raise and lower this, you will create a lot of radicals from decreased standard of living or increased standard of living unless you have a relatively high guaranteed liberties institution. Okay, so just kind of briefly discussing another thing that you can do here is, you see here, we can afford 400 points worth of consumption taxes because we have 400 authority. If we increase this, we can put in the consumption taxes and then we can decrease this. This is a very useful tool. You want to utilize this tool, but for the most part, I generally leave government wages stable here. And I think I underutilize, nudging it down and nudging it up and kind of massaging it in this way. And this is probably an okay way to generate a little bit more revenue, especially because it decreases, the construction sector prices and this sort of thing. But okay. For the military wages, I think that the bonus from the military wages is particularly good, and the malus from the military wages is really bad, and so I think it's generally worth it to keep the military wages on high, especially because they represent a relatively small portion of your economy. I think it's nice to keep the military relatively lean and kind of engage in wars that you can, you can get away with, and look to kind of have enough conscripts sort of defensively, and then for the most part not have an enormous active army and, go for smaller wars, especially in the early to mid game, and that only then, have a really caked up military, and so this will help keep wages down. For the bonus that you get on the military wages, you will get increased morale recovery, which is nice. It can help you end wars faster, which is, something that's difficult to quantify in terms of value, in terms of like budget, how worth it is to be able to put the army down faster or to start another war faster. And the malice is particularly annoying, especially when you're engaged in wars constantly, and since you cannot engage in multiple wars at once, I think best practice in Victoria 3 is to kind of always be at war, and the minus 75% training rate or minus 50% training rate is particularly pernicious. Also, the army power projection is non-zero in terms of importance because it will cause people to back down more often. If you are trying to get someone to not back down, you could, I suppose, lower military wages temporarily and do this sort of massaging thing, but for the most part, I think that this is usually the setup I go with government wages, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about it with them today. Now, we are going to talk about taxation level and consumption taxes more when we talk about our overall strategy, but consumption taxes are going to give you the most control because they allow you to tax anything. And this will allow you to, extract money. This is for consumption goods, not for, industrial. So you'll see there's no steel here because pops don't consume steel. It's not the market consumption, it's pop consumption. And they will have, varying outcomes and varying prices in terms of authority. Oop, that's not where we meant to go. And then finally, we have taxation level, which is your bread and butter sort of way of taxing. You get a bonus to legitimacy if you are down lower, and you get minus radicals from standard of living decreases. So generally speaking, when you want to start decreasing taxes is because when you start to care more about approval rating of, various interest groups, lowering taxes can be a good way to harvest, approval and this sort of stuff and generate more loyalists. And higher taxes will give you decreased legitimacy and increased radicals from standard of living decreases, and also decreased attraction of interest groups in government, which is a particularly annoying modifier. But for the most part, I think that having really high taxes is relatively good to do because it allows you to inject money via construction. You also running consumption taxes is good, but you could are limited in the amount you can run, and so this becomes a strategy of which ones, rather or not instead of like which ones do you want to, it's more of which ones do you want to use. And so this is kind of the tax methods. And now we got to talk a little bit about the overall strategy. Something that's important to note about tax level and consumption tax specifically is they only apply in incorporated territories. And so this, creates a bit of a strategy when it comes to incorporation. If we can just get that to freeze, we will see that the income tax rate and the consumption tax and dividends tax are applying, relative to the level of incorporation. And so while this is more of an incorporation type strategy to try and unpack which you should incorporate, what you should incorporate, it's important to emphasize or note that they are only applying to incorporated territories. So what the strategy is to eat the rich. The reason being is that standard of living scales non-linearly, and there's a bunch of good effects from taxing the rich rather than the lower strata. If we take a look, what do you mean by non-linear? The standard of living of the lower strata is 14 here with an income of 7, right? So it's double the income. If we take a look at the middle strata, it's roughly equivalent with an income of 23 and a standard of living of 24. And if we took a look at the upper strata, it's like a 1-to-7 ratio. The wealth is only 44 and the income is 271. And the reason for this is because there are there are needs that are scale exponentially with wealth. If we take a look at the browser and take a look at the wiki in Victoria 3, we will see that, there are temporary needs, there are constant needs, and then there are exponential needs. And these needs go up the richer and richer the pops get in a way that it does not scale linearly. So the more wealth you need, you will need a lot more. If we take a look kind of at a closer look at the graph, you will see, as you approach like 50 wealth, you start needing enormous amounts of luxury items and this sort of stuff. And they just absolutely blast way up. This is why you can't really ever get to 100 standard of living, for example, as a result of exponential needs. And your rich pops will be paying a lot more on exponential needs. And this is not preferred for several reasons. So jumping back into the game, we're going to talk about those reasons. So the first reason is going to be education access. There's wealth-based education access for everyone, and I know what you might be thinking, Generalist, you're a hack, you're an idiot, I'm on public schools. No, there's wealth-based education access for everyone. If you scroll about halfway down, you actually get a decent amount of wealth-based education access from your tech and base rates. It's going to be 0.5% per wealth. And so if wealth scales non-linearly, that means you are paying or it takes way more income to get the later percentages off of this. Also, coming back into it, they have more than enough wealth with 2% wealth education access or 2% education access per wealth. They almost have 90% wealth, 90% education access just off their wealth. And so they do not need help in the education access department. The lower strata do. And so when you tax the lower strata, you are going to significantly decrease their literacy rate because you're going to dramatically decrease their standard of living because it is so responsive. If their income is reduced to 5 or reduced by 2, their standard of living will drop by 4. If the upper strata's standard of living or their income is reduced by 5, basically nothing. Now, there's way more lower strata to tax, and so this is something, this is a non-zero effect, but you want to tax the upper strata for the point of literacy. Secondarily, you also want to tax them or target them for the point of migration. The reason being is migration attraction is based on average standard of living. If you tax the upper strata, you will negatively affect the average standard of living less per dollar or per ducat or per pound you extract. And the reason is because they are way less responsive, to a wealth extraction because they are scaling non-linearly. You have to take out a ton of income, to pull them down to 30. Just to clarify what I mean by the migration attraction, if we take a look at the migration attraction, the numbers behind it, the biggest driver is standard of living, or this is going to be one of the biggest drivers. You can also get huge arable land ones, in the New World specifically, but this standard of living means you want to have a high average standard of living, but having really rich pops, they don't pull up the standard of living that well in terms of how much money they're getting because it's scaling non-linearly and they have to spend so much money on luxury goods just to pull their standard of living up 1, whereas you need very little income on your lower rung pops in order to pull standard of living up. So how do we tax the rich with consumption taxes specifically? Okay, so what we need to do is we just need to go in the population tab and take a look at their needs and see what they're consuming, and specifically emphasize stuff that they're consuming that the lower rung pops are not. We have a relatively high standard of living at this point, so the middling pops are actually consuming much the similar stuff that the higher rung pops are, but you notice groceries will tend to be much lower for all of these, or in the middling pops, because the things that are scaling exponentially are these luxury items, are the ones that are really cranking up, as well as the art. And so these are the ones you want to kind of keep an eye on. And so, you know, just taking a look here, we see that services will be a good tax. Services is generally very efficient per authority, so services is good. Porcelain is good, luxury clothes is good, and luxury furniture will be good. These might not yield the absolute most in terms of consumption. You see that we could generate quite a lot from clothes, although this takes 300 authority. These might be the most efficient on a per authority basis, but they are also consistent with the strategy. But for example, sometimes liquor will make you more money than luxury clothes. But if we take a look in terms of population, we will see that, you know, the lower rung pops will tend to consume liquor more, and so generally you would not want to tax liquor unless liquor is going to make way more, you know, as opposed to a luxury good. You will want to tax the luxury goods. Also, notably with porcelain, if you're absolutely blasting construction, generally porcelain's an output along with glass, and so generally porcelain will be cheaper, and so your pops will consume more porcelain. So porcelain is often the most efficient, you know, in the late game, the most efficient tax in terms of your authority. And then we are also going to do the luxury furniture tax, and then we will reduce this. We had raised it up so that we could add more consumption taxes. Now taking a look here, we will see that we have needs of 5.7, 7.7, and 7.9. We're going to take a pause and we are going to wait until the next tick, and then we will see what the upper strata are paying in terms of taxes of their income. So after waiting to the next Monday, we can see that the taxes have gone up slightly on the lower strata. They went from 5.7 to 8.3, and so this is a decent chunk, but they've nearly doubled on the upper strata, which have gone from 7.9 to 14% taxes. If we take a look, they're paying a whole lot in consumption taxes. They're paying 6.1%, and, you know, in the middle for the middling strata, surprise, and then a much lower for the lower strata. And so this is a means by which you can, you know, target the rich specifically, and this is one of the reasons why consumption taxes are particularly good. They not only allow you to extract more money, but they allow you to extract money in a targeted way. And so, for example, if you have the option between running, you know, a higher amount of taxes, and you're thinking of how to extract money in the most efficient way possible, or putting in consumption taxes that specifically target the rich, you want to put in consumption taxes that specifically target the rich. Now, there is also a secondary effect that is pretty nice. Generally speaking, we don't like the arts academies. We hate the arts. We don't like the arts. There's nothing about the arts we like. Okay, what you do when you kind of depress specifically the standard of living of the upper rung pops is they need to be above 30 SOL in order to start consuming art. And so the more you depress them towards 30 SOL, you will actually improve their consumption profile because they'll be consuming less fine art and these sorts of things. Also, notably, like if you have like near infinite types of amount of money, you know, fruit and meat are better to tax if you have to start taxing food stuffs rather than you know, taxing clothes or the stuff the lower rung pops are consuming. You really don't want to tax anything that is like in this lower range because you will absolutely nuke the lower rung pops. Even if it's generating you a lot of money, it's still not where you want to be and how you want to go. You want to tax the rich specifically, and consumption taxes is the very best way to engage in that targeting. But you do have the trade-off of authority. You have to spend authority, and you are foregoing stuff like encouraging manufacturing industries edicts and these sorts of things in order to put in these consumption taxes. So there is a trade-off, but it is preferable to tax luxuries for this reason. So before we talk about the taxation level strategy, we have to talk about the taxation laws, because taxation level just implements the laws. So coming into the tabs, we are going to evaluate all of these. Starting with consumption-based taxation, it gives 35% consumption tax rate. This applies to literally every one of these tax methods. So you can think of the consumption tax rate or the consumption-based tax method as just being no taxes. It is potentially viable in the hyper late game, but generally you can just ignore this. Now, evaluating the other 4, we want to consider it through the lens of we are trying to eat the rich, we're trying to tax the rich as much as possible, and so you notice there's this change in revenue number. This is not the be-all, end-all in terms of which tax method is best, because remember, we're not just trying to extract as much as possible, we're trying to extract money in an efficient way as it relates to standard of living, and so when we are extracting, the way in which we're extracting matters, because it can be preferable to have a tax method that makes less money and just run a higher tax rate with that same method to achieve the same level of extraction out of the economy. Now we pay with the decreased legitimacy and the increased radicals, but this targeting can be worth it because it has positive effect on SOL, which is affecting migration and literacy and other factors sometimes like private health insurance. So coming back into here and looking at land-based taxation, we see that in addition to the consumption tax rate, let's drop this down to back the middling one, so it'll be at 35%. But in addition to the consumption tax rate, we have now income tax, which is going to tax everyone equally. This is generally a fine way to tax people, but we will also have the land tax, and this taxes money from peasants. And so this is particularly bad because it is taking money from the peasants. Now, if we look at our population tab and we look at the income of our lower strata who would qualify as the peasants, we see that they have an income of 7.3, so this would represent nearly a 10% tax on their income. They're not even paying that now with what we've got. In terms of everything combined. And so this would be particularly bad for nuking their SOL, which would, given that's nearly half our population here, or wait, no, that's way more than half our population, that will nuke our average standard of living and drive down migration and literacy. So this is not good. Coming back into it, it would actually probably be preferable, to be on consumption-based taxation and just tax way higher and target people with consumption. Although generally speaking, it's not worth the law pass to go from land-based to consumption-based taxation. It's pretty marginal. And sometimes you really just want the money for more construction. So sometimes taxing the lower rung pops is worth it, especially in the very, very beginning when you are really trying to get construction off the ground, which is often the context in which you would have land-based taxation. Jumping up to per capita, we have an improvement. So you notice there's an increase in income tax rate. There's the same consumption tax rate. It's going to be there for all of them. It's a decrease in land tax. It's still present, but now there is a per capita tax, and this is applying to all non-peasant pops. And so this will apply to all the people in the cities. And these people in particular will have, higher paying jobs. They will have higher wage multipliers. So this 0.7 is not as backbreaking in particular. And also we have, the higher income tax rate, which in terms of proportion is much more taxing the higher rung pops, when you are considering the fact that the per capita tax is also in here, proportionally to like land-based taxation. We're moving in the right direction. And then we have proportional taxation. Now you'll notice, the first thing you might notice, we would actually make more money here swapping back to proportional taxation from graduated. But it's important to note the differences between these two in evaluating which ones of these laws will be good, more than just looking at the number. Now, also important to note, in patch 1.3 relative to patch 1.2, there's been an enormous nuking of the dividends tax rate in both graduated taxation and in proportional taxation. But it does introduce, in addition to income tax rate, so the per capita tax is gone. There's also the introduction of a dividends tax rate. And if we take a look at our pops and we look at dividends taxes, these guys do not pay very much dividends taxes, the lower and middle strata, the pops that we want to tax less because we want to increase their SOL. And these guys pay a huge chunk of dividends taxes. And so we want to, in particular, dividends taxes is particularly good because it is taxing the right pops, for what's going on. We would make more money with this because when you swap to graduated taxation, you lower the income tax rate by 10%, on the middling, and you only increase the dividends tax by 10%. And so this results in an overall less money extracted. But before we started fiddling about with this save, we were running, I think, this notch of taxes, or maybe higher, and we were just running a higher tax rate with an inferior tax law in terms of the amount of money extracted here, so that we can target the higher rung pops more. Now, this is important to note, kind of where you're thinking of like the tax levels, in my opinion, graduated taxation is just best because you care about these sorts of things and you care about, you know, the SOL and the POPs, and you're trying to, this is scaling non-linearly with wealth, or sorry, wealth is scaling non-linearly with income, so you would rather tax the higher income people and you would rather just run a higher tax rate. And so coming in, we're going to talk about the taxation level strategy. So what I think the taxation level strategy is for the most part, you just absolutely want to blast taxes really high in the early to mid game, especially, even though you are on a sort of inferior tax method generally at that point in the game. It is very, very, very good because construction is really, really, really good. Construction is really important, and this isn't a video on construction, but the trade-off is you are decreasing consumption in your economy, consumption of consumer goods by taxing people more, but you can increase the consumption of goods specifically by increasing construction more, and particularly in the early to mid game, a higher percentage of your industries are going to be, you know, more on the industrial goods side. So let's just take a look. They're going to be more on the industrial goods side because you are emphasizing this in the early game, and so a higher price, a higher market price of these is preferable to having higher market price of consumer goods, which is what would happen if you decrease taxes, you increase consumption, so you increase the price. It would be preferable to have, relative to each other, you'd rather have higher industrial prices because you have more industrial buildings, and so even more especially you want to blast construction because of the way your economy develops. But as you start to reach like a middle and later type of period in the game, this proportionality fades, and you start to have a proportionate looking economy with a lot of consumer goods. And once you have this, lowering taxes becomes a better proposition. But particularly early on, when you're blasting all the construction stuff really high, most of your industry is going to be construction, and so you want to go this way. Now, I think that there are, relatively speaking, 5 inflection points, or 5 kind of periods which you should think about, which make you want to lower taxation, and that at the super end game, the super late game, you probably want to be on the absolute minimum taxes. And so I think the first one is kind of a moving target, and that is IG approval. If you are, let's say our industrialist was only plus 10 here, the industrialist bonus plus 20% to investment pool contribution efficiency, this is really, really, really good. And if we had an approval rating of 9, it would probably be worth dropping taxes just to try and get this guy up. And so you can use a tax level to try and massage people in a particular direction towards getting approval rating. You know, if you're right on the cusp specifically, it can become very, very good. Also, specifically, if you look at our legitimacy here, you will see we're at 88. Generally speaking, you don't want to move the tax slider too much because this will cause a lot of radicalism, specifically with increasing taxes. You can do it to decrease taxes as well. Sliding it around is a lot better when you're on guaranteed libs. But if we notice we're on legitimacy of 88, this is the second inflection point. Almost always, if plus 5 legitimacy would bump you into the next legitimacy tier, almost always it's worth actually just decreasing the tax 1 level to be in the higher tier and reap the bonuses of being in the higher tier, with the knowledge that, you know, when things change in government and this is no longer the case, you'll just increase taxes right back up and you'll be fine with this. And so this is especially useful when, again, you're on guaranteed libs, because when you seesaw back and forth, you have both fewer radicals and more loyalists when you seesaw around. So seesawing around in terms of, it can be good. And so this is the second inflection point. The third threshold is when you pass proportional taxation specifically. Often it can be worth decreasing taxes, maybe on a temporary basis, but for the main purpose of you just usually get a huge bump in the amount of money you're taking in for proportional taxation, and usually you're also suffering from some radical problems at this point in time. And also this is generally a point in time when the trade unionists have become demarginalized, but are not necessarily powerful, and they have particularly good bonuses, although solidarity has been nerfed, so got to think about that a little bit. But all these kind of factors combined, you know, you are at an inflection point where you kind of it's preferable to introduce construction slowly and not super fast, although kind of fast. And so when you pass proportional taxation, you'll generally be making money, and so lowering it on like kind of this inflection point, it can be particularly large, even though it's a little bit counterintuitive because the tax system is getting better and better, but at the same time you sometimes want to decrease taxes despite it getting better. And so this is an important inflection point. The fourth inflection point is a bit of a combo one, and it is when you are running out of peasants, and also when you are starting to really care about migration. You often want to start, easing the tax rate down for the purposes of attracting pops so that you can get employment. Now, it's important to note that if you've been taxing specifically the richer pops, this will have a positive effect on your average SOL, as per like the whole entire strategy, but decreasing taxes can be a useful way of battling for pops when this is becoming a particularly sticky problem. It's important to note that you have to be inside a customs union where you can actually sap off pops, but a good example here is Sweden. We accept Sweden's pops. We have the same average SOL. We're battling for pops to some extent in terms of migration. And so by lowering taxes, you can positively affect migration. This is also, as we discussed earlier when we were discussing, government wages, often when you run out of peasants, your SOL will also shoot up because the normal wage is shooting up because buildings are competing for labor. This means that you will actually usually just get a huge spike in your government expenditures, which is really uncomfortable, which is also driving up SOL like in a kind of circular fashion, leading to a sort of negative spiral. And so one thing I think you can do to try and help manage this is actually utilize the government wages, where what you can do is you can look to decrease taxes. We're at 404 here, where you can decrease taxes and then also decrease government wages as a means of trying to increase the SOL while decreasing the amount of money you are paying out in just in terms of raw government wages. And they shouldn't get too pissed at you, because if the normal wage is rising as labor is being competed for, then chances are their SOL or their average standard of living will not be dropping if you are decreasing government wages simultaneously, especially because they are also paying less taxes. And so this can be a way to try and drive up or massage up migration, that can be effective. But it is caring about the migration / running out of peasants can be a reason to decrease taxes, especially if you have an absolutely massive market and you can really siphon off a lot of pops. This can be a reason to decrease taxes because, the pops lead to cheaper labor. All of your buildings, their balance is a function of their revenue minus their expenses. One of their expenses is labor. And so if you can attract a lot of pops through migration, this will drive down the price of labor. It will be a delayed sort of lagging effect because it will keep the price of labor down. Labor won't go down in price as long as the building's profitable, because Victoria 3 is like bugged, but it will help keep the price of labor low, which will help keep buildings profitable, but this will be a lagging effect. So it won't be fully realized, but often it can be a situation where you want to decrease taxes to push migration. So often this is also another indicator, not just running out of peasants, but also passing multiculturalism could be a point where you want to decrease taxes, because now you're eligible for a whole bunch of extra migration if you have them inside of your market. The fifth inflection point is the late game, specifically in the late game when you start hitting a lot of unemployment and you have difficulty getting pops employed. It is generally preferable for the pops to be employed, and so once you kind of start hitting this threshold, lowering the taxes can be a good means of employing the pops, because as we discussed kind of towards the beginning of this video, when you increase the demand for all of these goods by decreasing the taxes, you increase the amount of people that can be employed in these. And so in particular in the late game, and as you get into the super late game, the taxes should actually trend down towards zero. And generally a good indicator of when this is starting to happen is if you had previously had no unemployment and unemployment is starting to rise. This can be an indication. This can also be an indication that you are just paying way too much out in welfare, but that's kind of a separate discussion, separate from the tax. If you are not paying out any welfare and you're starting to have a lot of unemployed pops, you probably want to start decreasing taxes, because it's going to have a variety of positive effects on your economy. Okay, so let's take a look at, in regards to our population. Previously, we had our tax rate at super low, which is how we got these numbers, which is 8.2% taxes at the lower strata, 12.4 on the middling, and 14 on the upper. We're going to increase taxes all the way, and we are going to come back, when we have ticked over towards next Monday. All right, so the taxes have shot up, and the first thing to notice is now we're running a deficit in the lower middle strata, so SOL will be dropping on those two. We have gone from an 8.2 to an 18.2 in the lower strata, up to 29% on the middle, and up to 38% in the upper strata. But the trade-off that we receive for this is we now have a bunch more money. Now, going back to our pie analogy, as we discussed earlier, we want to re-inject this money such that it would be, kind of the equivalent of if we had low taxes or something like this in terms of our overall budget, but we inject it with construction goods. And this is the overall strategy, as we discussed earlier, with the loud car motorcycle outside, with the idea being, that we do have these inflection points where we want to lower taxes, but if we do not have those inflection points in place, we want to blast construction instead, and that this will be preferable. Hopefully that this kind of illustrates these ideas, and also illustrates how we are trying to take money specifically from the upper strata as much as possible because of this asymmetry in terms of how much they are affecting the SOL in the country. In summary, it can be useful to think of your overall budget/tax considerations as in terms of a pie. As you extract more money, that is, as you tax more money or extract through any means, you shrink the pie, but you get a larger percentage of the pie. When you spend money or when you lower taxes, you increase the size of the pie, and this bumps up GDP. So this is an important or useful way of thinking about it. As far as taxes go, there are 4 different ways you can tax. One of them is tariffs. You don't want to use tariffs to generate money. The other is government wages. I find that middling government wages is pretty good, although I think there's probably contexts in which lowering or raising government wages is good, and I've underexplored this. Raising government wages specifically so you can introduce a new consumption tax, though, is particularly good, but then you just lower them back down. I think running high military wages is good. For national revenue, I think that there are some exceptions, but for the most part, especially in the early to middle game, you want to raise taxes as high as possible and then re-inject the money you're extracting via construction. I think in the hyper late game, you probably want to be on the lowest rung tax as possible, specifically when construction's not very effective anymore. This is a more effective way to stimulate the economy, also once you have a lot of consumer good industries. For consumption taxes strategy, this is kind of the angle in which you have the absolute most control. In particular, you want to tax the rich as much as possible, and so you want to tax the goods that they are consuming, not necessarily the goods that are, generating the most revenue. The reason for this taxation strategy on the rich, particularly, is because standard of living scales non-linearly with income. If we notice, the middling or the lower strata pop is nearly double their income. The middle strata is roughly equivalent to their income, and it's like 1/7 for the upper strata. So as you get more and more money, it requires more and more money to move up in a standard of living or a wealth level, and this is because there are exponential needs in terms of pops, specifically the luxury goods. And so because of this, if you tax, 100 ducats of an upper strata person, this won't move the needle very much in terms of SOL. If you do, you can't tax 100 off of the lower strata, but the equivalent of 100 or whatever it is, you will move the standard of living much more. You don't want to move the standard of living down for a variety of reasons, some of them including literacy that you get from base wealth access, but also migration. These are the 2 big ones, but there's other ones too. You can be on private health insurance, etc., mostly etc. And so this is the reason why you want to tax the rich specifically. So coming into the consumption goods strategy, this is what informs what products you select. In particular, one example that is particularly useful is liquor can often make you more money than a luxury good, but it will still be better to tax the luxury good. Now, as far as tax systems, you generally want to move towards graduated taxation for the same reason. You want to, in particular, be taxing the rich as much as possible, even though with the nerfs that we've received in 1.3, proportional taxation will probably often make you more money. Graduated taxation is still better because it taxes the right pot pops. Even if it generates less revenue, it would be preferable to be on a higher tax rate. And so this is, generally speaking, the strategy. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and or hit the notification bell, and or share. I think this is the longest I've spent recording one of these, so that would help out a lot. And other than that, have a good day.